So hello everyone, welcome to the latest edition of the GMG Webinar Series featuring Tom Butler, CEO of ICMM. Tom has been CEO of ICMM since July 2015. Before that, he spent 18 years with the International Finance Corporation in the infrastructure and natural resource teams, focused mainly on mining and power projects in Africa. From 2011, Tom was International Finance Corporation's Global Head of Mining, where he led a multidisciplinary team of specialists responsible for IFC's financing of mining exploration and development in emerging market countries. Tom will provide an overview of the governance, process, and current status of the Global Tailings Review, of which ICMM is a co-convener. At the end of the presentation, there will be a Q&A period. We will be monitoring the chat line, so for those who are unable to unmute to ask a question, please send a message through the chat feature. And now, if everyone can please put themselves on mute, we will begin. Tom, on to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to spend some time talking through the different initiatives that ICMM has at the moment on the subject of tailings. I'm going to talk about three things. This is the overview of the presentation. I'm going to first of all talk about the Global Tailings Review to develop a global standard for tailings management. Secondly, our own guidance for that to support that tailings management. And thirdly, a little update on our tailings aspirational goal, which we announced about a year ago in ICMM. First of all, the Global Tailings Review, progress to date and next steps. So I think everyone on the call is probably well aware of the Brumadinho tragedy in Brazil, which killed almost 300 people at the beginning of this year. And following that tragedy, we came together as ICMM with the CEOs of the member companies to discuss what we could do to improve and enhance the safe management of tailings facilities. We put 6 actions on the table for discussion with Council, and Council was strongly supportive of all 6. So the first 3 are to do with the Global Tailings Review and our own guidance. So first of all, Council committed to a high-level review, independent, that would develop an international standard that would include as the minimum consequence-based classification system and associated disclosure. And we also agreed to develop our own guidance using the expertise within the membership to support the implementation of that standard. We also agreed 3 other initiatives. Firstly, some shorter-term training, leveraging the Mining Association of Canada, supporting longer-term research and training, and then finally strengthening capacity within the membership to support members on developing a knowledge database and sharing lessons learned around tailings. So the Global Tailings Review, we spent quite a long time at the beginning discussing and agreeing the governance, because we recognized that governance would be key to a successful outcome. We decided to co-convene the Tailings Review with 2 other entities. One is United Nations Environmental Programme, essentially representing governments and broader society. And then PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment, which is an alliance of investors representing roughly $90 trillion that have committed to a set of principles around responsible investment. And they were obviously representing the investment community. And the 3 of us jointly negotiated and agreed a framework structure for the review. The slide that is up on the screen at the moment summarizes that structure. At the center of the review is Bruno Obel, who's the independent chair, who we selected jointly with the other 2 co-conveners. He is a former environment minister from Switzerland who's also worked both in the private sector and for the UN on the Global Resource Panel. And he, once he'd been selected, he selected the expert panel, who are the people surrounding him there on that slide, who essentially are doing the legwork on the review. And they represent a range of expertise, tailings experts, risk experts, health and safety, communities, and a lawyer. And then on the right-hand side, to provide punctual input from time to time is a broader multi-stakeholder advisory group, and you can see the key categories there: academia, civil society, financial institutions, industry and tailings experts, a legal advisor, multilateral organizations, and then other similar organizations, for example, the International Cyanide Management Institution, who implement the code. The roles of the different parties are outlined there. So the co-conveners, as I said, we defined the terms of reference, selected the chair and the advisory group. We're also monitoring progress as the chair proceeds with the review, providing input during the process to ensure that the standard is going to be ultimately fit for purpose. And we'll be providing the input on the final report, obviously, and recommendations. And a key requirement of the draft framework agreement is that the final product has to be accepted by all three co-conveners. So it has to be something that's fit for purpose for all three co-conveners. In the middle there, you've got the chair. You've got a summary of the key roles there. As I said, essentially the most important job was to select the expert panel and then to coordinate the work done by the expert panel, which is doing all the legwork, and then the advisory group
and then send it to us, and then we can add anything that we found or find. I can, yeah.
Inputs that are required from the Global Tailings Review. So the first one is an international standard for tailings storage facilities. We defined the scope as at least to include a consequence-based classification system, a system for credible independent reviews, and requirements for emergency planning. But we didn't define it beyond there because it's an independent review, so we left it fairly open in terms of what else the panel should look at. And then the second output is a recommendations report, which is to give the panel an opportunity beyond developing the standard to highlight issues that they've come across in their review and to make some broader recommendations, which might be directed at the industry or might be directed at governments or, for that matter, investors. So, as I said, the standard on the left-hand side is something that we've jointly agreed with the co-conveners needs to be acceptable to all three of us, whereas the recommendation report is more broad, more general, and we may or may not choose which recommendations to accept once we've seen the report. The draft standard has been published and is currently going through consultation, and I'll come to the consultation in a minute. These are the 6 topic areas in the draft standard. And essentially, the way it's written is that it's a set of principles, and underlying each principle there are a set of requirements which explain what they mean by each principle. And the principles fall into those topic areas. So the knowledge base is essentially understanding what's in and around the tailings facility as you're designing and building it. The affected communities is essentially around requirements for meaningful engagement with communities that will be potentially affected by a tailings facility. Category 3 is around, or topic 3 is around the technical aspects: design, construction, operation, closure should be in there, I think, and monitoring. Management and governance is essentially defining accountabilities, how these facilities will be managed and who's going to be responsible. And then 2 final topics around emergency response, including engaging with responsible authorities, and also requirements for public disclosure, which is essentially relates to how the standard will be delivered and showing how you're delivering on the standard. So this is the summary of where we are in terms of consultation, or whether the independent review is. Public consultation started in just after mid-November, and is online, and anyone who's listening is able to, by clicking on that link, to access the draft report, review it, and submit comments. And we welcome comments from anyone with an interest, whether individuals, companies, institutions, governments, and so on. The chair has also conducted supplementary consultation around the globe in the countries identified. He's just finishing up on that consultation at the moment. He's currently in Australia, which is the last of those 6 countries shown. He tried to choose a representative sample of countries, obviously broadly dispersed around the globe, but also with the sort of different types of issues faced by communities and regulators. And he also had an engagement with about 60 representatives of governments at the International Government Forum, which is an annual meeting held in Geneva in late October. So as I said, the online consultation is open. It finishes at the end of this year. So you've got about just over 2 weeks if you would like to submit comments. Slightly shorter if you don't want your holidays to be interrupted. That's the timeline, and once the comments are in, the review panel is going to be digesting all of them, integrating them into an updated draft, and the intention is to finalize the standard by the end of Q1 next year. And then move into launch and dissemination and implementation. So that's the Global Tailings Review, and I'm now going to move on to the second topic, which is the guidance for tailings management. So this is something that, as I mentioned, that we are developing in parallel. This was partly something that we had actually kicked off before the Brumadinho tragedy in response to a call for action that had come from Professor Morgenstern, who's a global tailings expert, that he made at a lecture in late last year, in fact, at a lecture in Brazil. But when Brumadinho happened and we decided to initiate the Global Tailings Review, we decided to fold the development of guidance into producing a supporting document for the implementation of the standard. So the intention is to produce comprehensive guidance on principles and practices for tailings management. The scope is outlined there. It's essentially focused on performance-based, risk-informed approach, which Professor Morgenstern feels the industry still has some way to go on. But the intention is not to provide detailed technical guidance to replace the technical bulletins from the likes of ICOLD and ANCOLD and the other good practice regional technical bulletins. So in case any of you are wondering about the difference between the standard and the guidance, the standard is essentially the what, and the guidance is essentially the how. So we're hoping that the standard will be very succinct, very clearly explain what companies need to do. Our members have committed to implement the standard once it's finalized and agreed by the 3 co-conveners. And obviously, as I said, has been developed by a fully independent process. The guidance is how to deliver on the what. It's been developed by our own members, the expertise within the ICMM membership, but we are hoping that others will use it as well. So it's obviously going to be a publicly available document that we will be broadly disseminating together with the standard once the standard is finalized. And within the ICMM hierarchy, which may interest people who are less connected with ICMM, but within the ICMM hierarchy, the top level requirement will be our existing position statement on tailings, which focuses on change management and governance. The requirements from the international standard developed by the Global Tailings Review. Beneath that, the supporting guidance based on the call from Professor Morgenstern, and then beneath that, the technical guidelines, as I mentioned, ICOLD, ANCOLD, which is Australia, CDA is Canada, Japan, and South Africa. So finally, just to cover quickly the aspirational goal that we announced this time last year, November last year. We collectively had agreed, as stated there, to work collectively to advance progress on developing superior and cost-effective alternatives to conventional tailings facilities. There are 3 different tracks of work with different timelines that underlie this goal. So the longest term goal is to reduce or eliminate tailings altogether, and that will be through finding alternative ways of processing or alternative ways of mining and designing mines. That will leverage a wide range of expertise, so not just tailings experts, but process experts, metallurgists, and others. The mid-term objective is to minimize the amount of water in tailings. So that's a slightly shorter timeline with the objective of accelerating the take-up, for example, of dry stacking and other technologies that mean that you don't need to have tailings facilities that contain water. And then finally, strengthening the operational performance of design, operation, and closure of facilities, which is a shorter term initiative. And clearly most of the work around that is on the Global Tailings Standard, implementation of that, and then implementation of the guidance. So a little quick update on progress on implementation of the aspirational goals so far. We have contracted Hatch to conduct a landscape review of alternative existing methods of mineral recovery that can reduce or eliminate tailings. That is ongoing, and the members are currently digesting a draft report for that. On track 2 and 3, which are the shorter term initiatives, we've held 2 vendor engagements so far, one in Santiago and one in November, based on about 20 pre-qualified vendors who presented different technologies to accelerate dewatering and also monitoring to the members. And then we're also mapping current research and development initiatives that are underway across the membership, with the principal objective of seeing whether there are efficiencies or opportunities to combine research where, for example, different members may be pursuing very similar initiatives in different parts of the world. So essentially this, the progress to date focuses on leveraging the collective global nature of the membership in ICMM. It's taken a little bit of a delay, given that we've been very focused on getting the standards and the review progressed. But once that is up and running, we'll be turning more attention to this and accelerating this initiative. So that's the 3 topics that I wanted to present to you today, and very happy now to take some questions and answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you, Andrea, sorry, to moderate the questions.
Thank you, Tom, for sharing the information with us. At GMG, we really work hard to bring the global mining industry together to collaborate and learn from each other to help break down the silos. And it's presentations like this that provide clarity on where the industry is going and where we need to come together to speed up progress. So thank you very much for that. So as Tom mentioned, we're now going to kick off the Q&A portion of the webinar. So if anybody has a question, please unmute yourself and ask away, or you can type your question into the chat feature.
I have a starting question. Hi. Oh, is there someone else on the line? So Tom, it's Heather. I was wondering if you could clarify a bit. Once the standard and the guidance are published, what are the next steps? So I'm sure there's got to be a plan to ensure it's actually being used and making a difference. So how do we see that outreach and implementation of the industry?
Okay, so the recommendation, the scope for the panel is to produce a standard and to recommend ways that it can be implemented most efficiently. So we have yet to see the recommendation report about how implementation would work. And obviously we would need to respond to those recommendations. As I said, the members have committed to implement the standard. I think we'll collectively have to take a view as to, depending on what's actually in the final version, as to how quickly that can be done. For example, there are some recommendations around independent tailings review boards. There are only a certain number of qualified experts in this area, so we will have to consider issues around capacity of these experts to get through the work that's being proposed in the standard. So that will be one issue. And then the other issue will be, how exactly the implementation and the verification is going to work. Obviously, from our point of view, one of the key features of this standard is because we've got investors involved in it, we're hoping that investors will be encouraging take-up beyond ICMM. So we're very much, only part of this process, and that's very deliberate because we're trying to develop something which will be taken up globally and not just by ICMM members. So we will be leading by example as a membership, but we hope to see it taken up more broadly. And part of getting it taken up more broadly will include a communications effort by the chair, once he's announced the standard and before he steps down, to socialize it and to promote it around the world. And then we'll have an ongoing communication effort around making sure that people are aware of it. But equally, PRI and UNEP will, I hope, be doing the same as well.
Okay, thank you.
We do have a question on the chat line.
It's two related.
Oh, two related ones, actually, yes. So someone is asking for more information on the vendor engagement resulting from expressions of interest to be presented in Santiago in July, and has the vendor selection already passed? Oh, and also where the and also related, were the selected vendors present in Santiago in July and notified of the selection, or is this a future action?
So this was last year, earlier this year, in Santiago and Vancouver. So the Vancouver was last month. And the idea was because we had, after Brumadinho, we had a lot of people writing to me and to people in my team with different solutions and proposals to help improve the monitoring, principally the monitoring, but also dewatering of tailings facilities. And that's why we decided to run a kind of pre-qualification and a call for expressions of interest process. But we have not contracted any of them. The idea was to give them an opportunity to pitch to individual members and then allow individual members to follow up, with vendors that interested them. So I don't have an update on how many members have taken up, on specific proposals. I know that it's not zero, so some of these conversations have progressed, but we're not involved in that as ICMM ourselves.
Perfect. Are there any other questions for Tom?
Yeah, hi, I had a question. The long-term goal, which you have Hatch working on, are you able to give us an indication of the type of size of that contract? Because that kind of help understand how wide they're going, because there are so many different processes or mining methods out there that and resources that generate tailings. So I'm just trying to work out, how wide is their scope.
So they've not been tasked with coming up with solutions. They've been tasked with mapping existing initiatives. So this is a mapping. It's not a it's not a contract where we've said go off and develop 2 or 3 new technologies. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Aside from peer review, Tom, are there other ways? I know people are so keen to collaborate in this space. So is there any other ways you suggest people could get engaged now?
Well, not right now. I mean, I think once the members have had a chance to digest the mapping on the longer term initiatives, there may well be opportunities for collaboration on that. But as I said, we're very much, I think the next 2-3 months are going to be very much focused on reviewing and finalising the standard and promulgating that, and that's where the most urgency is. I think quite rightly, given the 2 big tragedies that we've had in Brazil in the last 3 or 4 years. Beyond that, I think there may be opportunities, but too early to say at the moment.
We have another question in. Oh, sorry, someone's talking?
Yes, this is Robert Snow. Can you provide any input or discussion on the way the public reviews will be considered for the standard, and then ultimately who will be responsible for finalizing the standard?
So that's the chair's responsibility to finalize it. He's got the rather difficult task of integrating what we're expecting will be a very wide set of comments. Obviously, he's had a lot of comments already from the face-to-face consultations that he's run in the countries that I mentioned. But then he'll have to deal with the online comments, and I know that investors will be commenting either collectively or individually. Obviously, ICMM as a membership will be commenting. I'm sure there will be comments from individuals, from NGOs, and also from non-member mining companies. So there will be a wide range of comments, and he's going to have to knock all those comments into shape and knock the draft into shape, reflecting the different comments received. And in order to help him do that, he's obviously got the expert panel who are doing the legwork, and he'll also have a meeting with the multi-stakeholder advisory group, with whom he'll be able to calibrate any comments that he's received where he's got some doubts. But ultimately, the finalization is in his terms of reference, and subject to the final standard being acceptable to the co-convener. So he has to also take our comments into account. It's his responsibility to finalize it. So the timeline is ambitious. We're hoping that can be done in 2 months, but we don't know whether we're going to get 100 comments or 10,000 comments. So there may be, if there's a huge number of comments, there may be a sort of logistical challenge just to sort of group the comments into different themes.
We have a few more questions in the chat line. Someone wants to know what the process looks like for reviewing the comments submitted, addressing them, redrafting the standard, etc.
So the consultation closes end of December. As I said, we don't know how many comments will come in, but there'll be a sort of a certain amount of time required to digest all the comments, to group them into themes, and then the chair is meeting with the expert panel and the advisory group to have a first stab at addressing all of the comments, deciding which ones you know, to take and which ones not to take. I mean, inevitably there'll be comments where he'll have to take a view as to whether they're practical or not.
Okay, there's also someone asking if you have a feel for the degree of uptake by the various jurisdictions.
Too early to say, I think. There's certainly a lot of interest, for example, in Brazil about, you know, whether this would help, and I think there's a hope that it will help. One of the things that I've been emphasizing to countries and to regulators is that we're not seeking to replace existing regulatory requirements. So this is a voluntary initiative, and you know, it's driven by industry and by investors, but it doesn't seek to replace what regulators are currently doing. So you know, the uptake in the first instance will be looking to the private sector and investors to encourage uptake by companies. What tends to happen with initiatives like this is if they're seen to be robust and they seem to work after a few years, some of the parts of initiatives like this can become kind of norms and end up being integrated into regulations down the road. But governments understandably tend to be a bit more cautious about you know, how they approach that, and tend to want to see that you know, it's proven to work before they do it. But there are precedents for that, you know, with other bits of self-regulation, both in the mining sector and elsewhere. So I'm hoping that they'll come up with something which will be robust and good, and which ultimately, you know, governments might sort of pick parts of, or even the whole thing, and you know, say that it's a requirement, but we're a long way from there at the moment.
Tom, it's Leif Carroll here from Accenture. Have any of the host governments or the institutional investors been involved in the actual process of drafting the standard?
Not directly, because the drafting was done by the members of the expert panel, and none of them are representatives of governments. But they have had they've solicited a lot of input, you know, as they put the draft together. To be honest, I'm not sure whether they had input from governments on that or not.
Tom, will there be a second consultation round if the draft significantly changes based on the first round of comments?
Well, that's not currently envisaged, and that will be down to the chair to decide. But currently, his plan is not to go through a second consultation round.
It's Leif again. Is there a plan for the launch and dissemination, or some sort of training seminars for the member companies of ICMM?
Well, we will do all of that, but we don't have a plan yet because we're not certain of the timing. So as I said, you know, if we only get 100 comments, and they're all exactly the same comments, then it would be pretty easy to update the draft. But if he has to deal with, you know, 10 or 20 or 100,000 comments, our timeline starts to look a little bit ambitious. So we haven't set any dates yet for the launch or dissemination or training, for that matter. I think that will be a second step, and once we've got some clarity about you know, timing of finalization, then we'll you know, start planning you know, those parts of the you know, communication and launch.
We have another question from the chat line. Are there any plans for vendors to need to become certified to the new standard in order to provide products or services?
That's not in the standard, no. So no plans.
So I guess with this, we will close this edition of the webinar. Tom, thank you again, and thank you to everyone who joined. A recording of the webinar is going to be available on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And I'd like to take this opportunity, given we're in mid-December, to wish everyone a happy, healthy, and safe holiday season. Good day, everyone.